There's a little triangle there, that was a representation of a turtle, and you gave programming instructions for where it should drive, and it left a line. So my first experience programming was making graphics. One of the cool things about it too was when you had a bug in your code, it looked more like this. So it was really obvious that you had a problem. In my world now, bugs in our code look a little more like this.
No.
This is when the hair simulator goes awry and Doug's hair gets crazy. A lot more fun. But I've never been one to really follow exactly the normal path. When I was getting ready for 8th grade, I was looking at the classes that were available. There was this class called Power Mechanics that I thought sounded awesome. The idea behind it was the people in the community in Boulder, Colorado, where I grew up, when their lawnmower died, they'd bring it into the hardware store to buy a new one, and the hardware store would donate it to our school for this class. And you would take the lawnmower apart piece by piece and put it back together, and maybe if you've been paying attention, the lawnmower might work again. And I thought this sounded really cool. But I also was pretty sure there weren't going to be any girls in this class. And people might think it was pretty weird. And I don't know about the rest of you, but for me in 8th grade, I was trying really hard to fit in and not to stand out. So I had to take a moment, a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, to really think through whether I was willing to sort of take that chance. But I really thought the class sounded so cool, and so I decided to take it. And I showed up on the first day, and I was 100% the only girl in there, and people definitely thought it was weird. But my middle school career was not ruined. I didn't turn into a social pariah. It was like kind of okay. And every day I'd show up to class, and we'd take the lawnmowers apart, and then we'd slowly put them back together. And at the end of class, we rolled our lawnmowers out into the sun on the football field. And for whatever reason, I happened to be last in line, and so I'm watching as the teacher is putting gas in the row of lawnmowers. And everyone is pulling the cord on their lawnmower, and nothing's happening. And so you can imagine the mounting sense of not only suspense, but despair, because this is literally the only thing we have done in this class the entire semester. And so I get gas in my lawnmower, and I take a deep breath, and I pull as hard as I can. And my lawnmower roars to life, and there's this long line of guys looking at me like, what? And I did what any self-respecting lawnmower repair person would do, and I ran around the football field mowing the lawn, of course. So, for me, it's always been a thing where I'm going to follow the things that I love or have a fascination with. And so that brought me to studying computer science in college. This beautiful building is where I spent a lot of my time on campus, in the basement programming computers, very glorious. Later in life, when I was giving one of these talks, I Googled computer science and Harvard, and this is the picture that came up. And I have to tell you that this is not what it looked like in my classes. First of all, we had maybe 10% women when I was there, and I really don't remember laughing and looking like I was having that glorious of a time in class, but you know. But in terms of computer science is already a relatively challenging thing to major in, but I also had to kind of work through, when I walked in the room, no one looked like me, and so it felt like I didn't belong there. And for anyone that's programmed a computer, you get bugs in your code, and so anytime anything went wrong, like you got a bug in your code, it only served to sort of underscore that you didn't belong there. So there was a lot of things to kind of like persevere through. But my junior year, I took this computer graphics class, which was the class I had my eye on since I first got to college. And one day, the professor, instead of talking about multivariable calculus and ray tracing and matrix math, he turned out the lights and he showed these short films. And I think this was probably the first computer animation that any of us had ever seen. And it was like this magical moment for me where I was like, that's what I have to do with my life. I have no idea how I'm going to do it, but that's what I have to do with my life. And the idea that all the math, science, and code that I have been learning can come together to create worlds and characters and tell stories was just like pure magic to me. My junior year, Pixar released Toy Story, and it was the first feature-length animated film that had ever been released, computer animated film. And so then Pixar became my target of places to work because I thought, well, they have jobs doing this, and they have made those short films, and now they've made this feature film. And so about 7 or 8 months after I graduated, I started at Pixar, and that was in February of 1997, so I've been there 27 years. In the beginning, I started on A Bug's Life, and I did some programming, but I can't really make it terribly interesting to tell you what I was doing. But by the time I hit Toy Story 2 and Monsters Incorporated, I was actually doing technical stuff and coding that ended up on screen. So I'd love to show you an example of that. This is from Monsters Incorporated, and my boss came to me and said, hey, so-and-so made this tree outside the window. We need the leaves to flap in the wind a little bit. Can you write a little bit of code to do this? It's not a super challenging problem. You take the leaves and you use a sine wave to change the angle of the leaves, and the sine wave is only important because it oscillates back and forth. And I just look like some dumb lady doing bad waving at you right now, but if you offset it in time and then you add another rotation, you can see how it kind of looks like leaves flapping in the wind. So I wire that up to a control where if the director wants a hurricane force winds, we can do that. If he wants lazy flapping wind, we can do that. So let me show you what that looks like. This is also my first experience where you might do a project for a movie and no one will ever notice it. So one of the things I love about computer animation is you can take super simple things and you throw a little math, science, and code out there and get really amazing stuff. And so here we're going to just take some points. And for a visual effects group who does things like sparks, but also explosions, fire, water, clouds, all kinds of things, this is one of the ways they do that. And so here we have something called a particle emitter. This is just points in a software called Maya. And we're saying, give us 200 of these red spheres that look like they're made out of dull plastic. And this is doing a physics simulation of that. Because it's physics, we can give it any kind of forces. So if we turn on gravity, we get something more like this. And so if instead of 200 red spheres, we had way more than that, and they look like they were made out of water, you could imagine this would look like a fountain in Ratatouille, say. Next, we can add wind, or color and size that changes with time. You can imagine for something like sparks or fireworks, this would be perfect. You may not have noticed, but we were not dealing with the ground, and now we're actually turning on the calculations so these bounce along the ground. If you don't really notice, we might turn that off because it makes those physics simulations come back faster because there's less calculations to do. But turning them on allows us to do something fun called contact events, which is whenever it hits, do another spray of particles. So for splashes or dust hits, this is the kind of thing we use. So we can use this for something like sparks, but we can also use it to generate something like the bridge that's made out of marigolds in the movie Coco that connects the land of the living to the land of the dead. So in a shot like this, where Hector is trying to get across that marigold bridge, you can see that this is just the same thing with a whole bunch of particles that when we render it in the end, we swap those orange spheres out for little petals. Now, the director said I wanted to feel like he's really wading through them so it feels hard to get through, but they still have to look like marigold leaves. So, in this one, you see these white spheres. That's where we're tracking all the spheres, and when they break away from their neighbors for long enough and become orphaned, as we call it, they're right here. We swap those out for the petals that are now fluttering down. So you can still get the struggle through almost like snow, but it still stays true to being those marigold petals. And this is all just done with math and code.
Just a little further.
Poor Hector. So I've done lighting for many, many years. I did it on a little bit on A Bug's Life, then Toy Story 2, then Monsters Incorporated. And by that point, it was clear that that was what I really wanted to do and what I loved. So let me show you a little bit about why. So this is a shot from WALL-E. And this has what we call white lights. This is the lights that other departments use when they don't care about our lighting, because what they really want is for the computer to move quickly. And these are very fast for the computer to calculate, so it doesn't slow the computer down. When it gets to lighting, we throw those lights out and we put in our own lights. And it looks a little something like this. And so you can see the dramatic difference. And for me, it's kind of magical. To me, this is almost where the world comes to life, and I feel like I'm stepping through the screen into a place that actually exists. We use a lot of age-old art principles where if you squint at an image and it's been composed well, you should be able to see, know where you're looking. This one's kind of a disaster. But if you look at it with the lighting in it, suddenly, hopefully, you see Buzz Lightyear, who is the smallest thing on screen, but he's the brightest thing over the darkest thing with these green fog beams pointing at him. So we direct the audience's eye in that way. This became critically important in the movie WALL-E because there is no dialogue in the first 20 or 30 minutes of the movie. And so if you are missing WALL-E, which you might be here, you might miss some critical setup in the movie. And maybe this helps you see how critical lighting is, especially in this movie, to even see him driving around in the garbage. So my favorite before and afters come from the movie Coco. This is a lot of stuff on screen, kind of colorful, but doesn't make a lot of sense. Once you get the lighting in it, it becomes this teeming city with a lot of magic to it. So over my 27 years, I've worked on, this is a sample of some of the movies I've worked on. I've worked on 15 feature films there. Currently, I've been thrown onto Inside Out 2 to just help out, get that film done as it's supposed to be done in like 2 weeks. And it's going to be in theaters June 14th. So I actually am over there moonlighting a little bit, doing some lighting, which I haven't been doing a long time actually. Over the time in all these movies, I've seen a lot of things. So I'm going to show you some of them that will describe how we bring these worlds to life. So Brave is a fantastic one because we were making the Scottish forest, which was really fun. And at the time we were doing the R&D for this, we had just released the movie Up. And so this is a shot from Up, and you see the jungle. And we're trying to do something far more complex that looks a little something like this. And so what we had to do was throw out our typical way of doing vegetation and something like a forest, because this was not going to cut it. This is a lot of hand-placed stuff in a three-dimensional world inside the computer. And we would never finish the film if we were trying to hand-place all the stuff in the Scottish forest. So we had to throw out the old way and come in with a new way. And we had this brilliant guy, Inigo Kuleth, who came in, no panic at all. He just got right down to it, and he created this thing called Wonder Moss that was originally only supposed to be for the moss, but was so successful we used it for all the vegetation. Now, we needed to be able to put a lot of stuff on screen, and Inigo's code, the key part of Wonder Moss, is that the computer can do a ton of calculations on a line, or as we call it, a curve. And so if everything can be made out of curves, we can get a ton of stuff on screen. So if we turn on the first part of his code in Wonder Moss, you can see how much of the world is based off these curves. Now this looks like kind of a silly pincushion Dr. Seuss kind of world. But as we turn on the next elements, say the enveloping, which is the bumping and clumping that makes it feel much more organic and natural, you can see that we're already getting to somewhere more interesting. And I want to point to the bush there that was yellow pincushion. Now it looks like it has flowers on it. So the important piece is the computer still thinks that's a curve, but because Inigo is brilliant and magic, what shows up on screen looks like a flower or looks like a leaf. I can figure out how he makes it look like a blade of grass or a pine needle, but it's part of his magic that he made it look like all these other things, but the computer could still do all these calculations on it. So next we turn on gravity. Now this is unlike the visual effects I just showed you where we were doing a physics simulation, because these are curves, we can just bend them towards the Earth. We don't put gravity in, so you'll go, to work the next day and stand at the water cooler, go home and say, did you see that latest Pixar film? It's got some amazing gravity in it, doesn't it? We're doing that so that it looks more natural, so that you don't even think about it, and so that you can be immersed in the movie and really believe the world that we've created for you. And we spend an enormous amount of time doing things like that so you won't notice them. Okay, so color variation, obviously, with vegetation is really important. It gives you the sense of kind of fresher vegetation and older vegetation. And then the next part, which is one of my favorites, is called extra curve variation, which is all these little bits of logic in there that really take this thing over the top. And so the easiest way for me to show you that is actually, this is, as Inigo was developing this code, you can see that there's clover growing in the divots on the trees. His code is finding divots in things, and he knew that that would have less sun on it because it would be shadow, and that's where the clover would grow. Previously, an artist would have been sitting there saying, maybe y'all will have some clover here, and I'll put some clover here, and I'll put some clover here. But with Inigo's code, you push a button, and it figures out how to do all this stuff, and it works. This is one of the most successful combinations of art and tech that I've ever seen at Pixar, and it was because when he looks at nature, he sees math in a really different way than anyone I've ever met. It's really cool. So the last piece is wind. This is very similar to that tree that I was showing you from Monsters Incorporated. Another one of those things that we call it keep alive, but it's just a little bit of something so the world doesn't feel dead and it's more believable to the audience. Now, putting all that code together, we can create the Scottish forest, and by tweaking a couple variables, we can get all kinds of different settings. So the setting for the castle, by the riverside, or even in the Scottish Highlands. And one of the things for me that this really points out is how much you can combine technology or programming with anything at this point, and the combination of the two creates something all the more powerful. Now, WALL-E was a really interesting movie for us, where I mentioned it, but no dialogue in the beginning, and so we had to do a lot of visual storytelling. And so we needed the audience to understand that we were on Earth for this movie, and so one of the many ways we did that in the beginning, you notice that the street lamps here look very much like current day street lamps, and so that's one way we're trying to indicate that you're on Earth. We're also telling the audience that this is a big box store, by and large, or B&O has taken over this world, and so you can see there's just advertisements everywhere. Then we get into some of the more character moments where we're telling you that Wally's job is to cube up the garbage. And this one is a really interesting one where you can see Wally driving in the background here and all the Wallys in the foreground. We internally call this the dead Wally shot. And what we're setting up here is that Wally wasn't the only robot. There were a whole bunch like him, but he's the only one left. And then we get to show you things like that Wally values things differently than we do, such as in this shot. And just kind of how charming he is. We do all kinds of subtle storytelling too. This is one of my favorite. I'm a total color nerd coming from lighting, and the color green was an important one in this movie where the whole first 20 or 30 minutes, you're really in this kind of tan beige color palette. And our production designer, Ralph Eggleston, super talented guy, he kept saying, no green, no green. And every now and again, you would see some green garbage in the background because someone put it in there by accident. And he'd say, no, take the green out. Everyone was like, all right, Ralph, all right, whatever, and they'd go take it out. And then pretty soon we understand why Ralph was so adamant about there being no green, because really the crux of this point of the movie is when Wally finds the plant. And so because the audience has not seen green for 20 or 30 minutes, this has a much greater visual impact when he finds the plant, which helps serves to underscore the story. Another subtle storytelling bit in Wall-E is with the robots. So our crowds team had to figure out how to make a whole bunch of different robots, and so they decided there were kind of three things they needed to get in the robots, which is hover, reaction, and anticipation. So hovering is competing forces to keep them in the air. And they had these controls for it that they gave to the animators to dial in to get different personalities in these robots. So you can see, here's an example of just three of them. Kind of frenetic in the middle, and then more of a lumbering or uneasy in the other two. And just by changing a couple different forces on them, you can get a really different feel for who these robots are. Then we've got the reaction to forces, which is having overshoot or leaning and banking and bouncing around so they feel like not just these super robotic dead things. But my very favorite part, and this is where I feel like it's the most storytelling, hidden storytelling, is the anticipation that they built in. So there's bits of code in each one of their brains that looks forward a couple frames and sees when there's a curve coming and starts to bank. And if you think of a robot, it's an unthinking thing in a lot of ways. But this is kind of how we're telling you that it's, it's not passive, it's actually thinking about stuff. And so built into that math is the robot starts to anticipate the curve before going around it. So here's a shot with some of the robots and hoverboards in it. So early on in the movies, we do something we call a diorama or test shots where we quickly throw everything together so we can get a sense of things and know what technology we need to build for the movie or where we need to make things look better or various elements like that. So this was our diorama, and this looks like some bad version of Wall-E. This is what a similar type of shot looked like in the final movie, so you can see the difference. But this was a big one. We did actually 19 shots in this. And we showed it to people that aren't in the film at the time within Pixar. And there were two things, I'm sure we learned more than this, but two big things One was that we learned from this, which is some people said, well, Wally looks too frail to really believably have survived 700 years. So for the movie, we kind of bulked him up a little bit. But for me, much more relevant to me is it turns out as humans, when we watch something that has sort of red atmosphere, we immediately think it's Mars from all the science fiction movies where that's what Mars looks like. So I actually had to be really careful in the movie to keep it more in these sort of beige, tan, orange, whites, and not go to red, because otherwise I'm single-handedly ruining all the setups that's being done to say that this is taking place on Earth. Okay, so this gives you some sense of things, hopefully. Now I want to tell you about one of my favorite worlds that I have gotten to work on, and that was the Land of the Dead in the movie Coco. Now we're what we call a director-driven studio, which means all of the stories come from the directors. The directors decide everything. They sort of approve everything that goes in the movie. So for the Land of the Dead for Coco, we said to the director, well, what should the Land of the Dead look like? We have no idea. And he said to create a world like no one has seen before, which is basically the worst piece of information you can give anyone. It's not very helpful. We could have done something like we did for a Monsters movie, where we take kind of the real world and we monsterize it by putting fangs and spikes and wings on things like you can see in this image. Or the Cars films, where we do something we call carifying, which is, this is Radiator Springs, and you see the near mountain looks like a radiator cat, and the far mountains are Cadillac things. It's called the Cadillac Range. But that felt kind of lame for something where we're trying to describe the afterlife, and we're trying to celebrate a country's sort of rich cultural history and this great holiday. So we got to work in the art department doing image after image of what this world could look like. Here's a variety of those images. Months and months go by where these images go out, the director comes, looks at them, discusses it, isn't quite sold, keep going, keep going. We also, during this time period, we did a bunch of research trips to Mexico during the holiday and otherwise, and we got really into these pictures we took in a place called Guanajuato. It had these colorful buildings going up the hillsides. It has these narrow stairways leading off to who knows where, and bridges over alleys. And it's also an old silver mining town, so there's all these tunnels underneath. So it has this kind of layered thing going on, and kind of mysterious and kind of cool. And then we love the arches and how the buildings were glommed together. So after kind of putting all these together and months of working on this, we land on this touchstone image that the director loved. Now you all are experts at this point in knowing how to do this, so you know that this is going to be really hard because there's a ton of stuff on screen like there was for that Scottish forest. The director at this point had told us that he created a world like no one's seen before, and also the world has to have fantastical verticality, and it should be colorful, vibrant, and lively for the ancestors. So we're kind of hitting on that, and the truth is that those towers are really the base of this whole world, so we're going to start building the towers in the computer. This is an early pass. We're just giving the computer these gray boxes and some shapes and using code to fill them up. Soon we move on to something like this, where we've built tiny little buildings so you get a better sense of scale. We've hidden a skull in the middle one, if you can see the eyes, the nose, and the teeth. And we've kind of made these platforms where we can have sort of city centers, but it's still, they kind of look rock-like and not exactly like someone lives there. We realize as humans, we always put dwellings around a path or a road. So we changed the code so we have this spiraling road and have it put the buildings along that road, and we get to something that's getting to be a lot more interesting. You can see here. You might notice those roads end, so if you drove on these roads, you drive off the end of it. It was okay because they were just supposed to be kind of mid-ground to background, so you wouldn't really be able to see that. And it finally feels like we're getting somewhere. We're running out of time. This is a really common theme in our movies, is that we're always running out of time to pull something off. So our sets department decides to make this really cool fly-through of these towers with like a painted backdrop to try and convince the director of how cool this is. And so he's watching this, and everyone's kind of holding their breath because we really are out of time. I'm panicked because we haven't been able to light this thing. It'll become obvious to you in a little bit why that's a huge deal. But the director loves it, and everyone sort of breathes a sigh of relief. Until he says, we should put a shot like this in the movie. And if you notice, we flew a camera right by that tower, and these were only built to be mid-ground and background. So our poor sets team then had to go make a sort of higher fidelity tower, at which point they had to abandon this code-based way of doing it, and instead went with this much more modular way of doing it. And so one of the modelers built these little bits of buildings that were almost like Lego pieces that they assembled into what they called chunks. Here's one chunk and another chunk. And there were 15 chunks total for the whole movie that they could assemble in different ways into neighborhoods and then into towers. And because we've worked in this finesse but modular way, we could get it done in a reasonable amount of time. It also meant the director could shove the camera in anywhere he wanted, and it looked finessed, but it also had all the things we love, these archways, the stairways that inspired us, the buildings belong together. So putting all this work together, we get this shot that is the introduction to the Land of the Dead. Now I mentioned I was panicked about the lighting part, because this has 8.5 million lights in it, which is about 8.49 million lights more than we'd ever done before. So we had a lot of work to do in terms of figuring out technologically how we could do this. Disney asked us to get this shot ready for a trailer when it wasn't ready, and it was taking 1,000 hours of compute time to generate one frame. There's 24 frames per second of film. We told them no, and they said yes, and then we said okay, because they're our boss. And we had to throw really smart people at optimizing it and just trying to finish lighting it so it looked good enough to go in. Got it down to 400 hours for that trailer. We showed it to the director, and we're like, you can't make any changes, there's no time. And for the movie, got it down to 100 hours a frame, and a lot of those optimizations played a role in bringing down everything in terms of time for the Land of the Dead. Now, a second ago, I showed you this fly-through. Within about 6 months, maybe a little more, it looked like this. I never counted how many lights were in there. So Coco's one of my favorite movies that I've ever worked on, and it was especially, it has lived on for a long time, and that I still get people coming up to me and telling me how much it meant to them. We were really concerned about making it authentic to the Mexican culture and that holiday, because we were a bunch of Americans making a movie about someone else's culture. And so we went to a lot of lengths to make sure that it landed in many ways. And one day I was giving a talk at my high school in Boulder, Colorado, and some students waited around after to ask questions and stuff. And there was this one young woman hanging back, and she, after everyone's gone, she comes up to talk to me, and she said, "I just want to thank you for Coco." And then she started to, she was trying not to cry. And she said, I watched it with my brother, and when Miguel came on the screen, my brother pointed at the screen and said, "He looks like me." She said, "We just don't ever get to see any movies with people in them that look like me." And I always knew, but this really underscored how much it means to see ourselves represented on both big and small screens. And I think Coco really landed that in an important way based on the response I've gotten afterward. Now, Turning Red was the last film movie I worked on that was released in, it went to Disney Plus. And in the hallways before people were going onto that film, we heard that the director was really interested in kind of trying to find a new look outside the Pixar look. And as someone who loves art and using technology to bring art to the screen, this was really intriguing. And so instead of putting my name in to direct the lighting, I put my name in for the visual effects supervisor position, which is in the leadership group of the movie, and is my friend described it as sort of the CTO of the movie. When I got that position, I think I really blew up some assumptions about what that visual effects supervisor position was, because typically the people that had filled that role have very deep technical. And at Pixar, I've been doing lighting so long that when you're directing lighting, you're pretty much sitting down with people directing lighting. You're not solving a lot of technical problems because you don't have time for that. And so I think people have forgotten that I had any kind of technical background, and they really thought of me as more of a creative. But that's the beauty of, I wasn't in 8th grade anymore. I didn't care about fitting in. I was perfectly happy to try for a role that hadn't been filled by a woman in 20 years either. And as a combo of a visual and a technical person, I was really intrigued by driving technology to come up with a new look and really pushing the envelope. So when I got on the movie, it was with a lot of excitement and a little bit of nerves that I went off to see what kind of rules we could break, how we could defy convention, because I really knew that getting the job was one thing, but I had another 3 years in which to prove that I could actually do it. Now, for those of you that haven't seen Turning Red, or those of you that have, I guess, here's a shot that I think exemplifies what we were doing.
We are 4 townies, remember? Ride or die!
It is like this perfectly over-the-top shot of our main character May in her boy band fantasy with pink clouds and sparkles, and the boy band with the wind blowing in their hair and the dove flying off, and there was a lot of like very funny sort of tongue-in-cheek stuff happening in this movie. But one of the best ways that I can show you how we really defied convention was in our animation room. So on the left is how we would traditionally animate a character. Over the years, Pixar animators have built up this real Bible of how you animate so they can get some of the best animation in the entire world. And one of them to get natural motion is you never move the way she is on the right. You always have multiple axes of motion, because that's how humans move, with the idea being that to buy the emotion of this animated character, they have to feel believable. Well, Red turned that on its head, where she's only moving her arms in what ended up in the film on the right. And you can see, actually, you still buy the emotion because the whole movie is set up with this kind of, that flavor and style to it, and it's much funnier than it would have been if we just animated it sort of the regular way. Now, this is a picture of Brett. He's a longtime animator at Pixar, and the instructions he was given for this shot were just move Panda May's arms, and you can see he is animating the way he would have on a traditional Pixar movie. So they said, no, Brett, really, like, just move her arms. So this is his second pass at it. And you can see still not just moving her arms. It took a lot for the animators to buy into this like other way of animating. So here's the third pass, and he almost gets it, but he still can't quite. And so here's the final shot in the movie. It's so funny. But it's really, that was the flavor of this movie. The animators also, May has her 3 besties, and so they're trying to emphasize how this is like her ride or die crew, her squad, and so they wanted to move them all as one as much as possible. And so here's one where you see traditionally how we would do this shot and how we did it on Turning Red. And it's so poppy and fun. Here's another one with all their heads popping in, or this one where they're trying to convince May to go to karaoke. So that's just a little flavor of things. Here's various shots from the movie where you get some of the sense of anime was a big inspiration because the director, that was an influence on her, and some of the graphics we did, and some of the various elements that came into play in the movie. And in the end, we pulled it off. We pulled off the movie with a lot of different elements than we had done before. But we didn't just defy convention in the style or the technology that we brought to it. This is the leadership team of the film. In the middle is Domi Shi, who is the director. She's a brilliant director. She was also the first solo female director we've ever had direct a film at Pixar. I was the first woman in 20 years to do the visual effects supervisor role. And these two things made it possible for us to have the first all-female film leadership team in Pixar's history, which you see here. Woo. This is a picture from what we call our wrap party. So when we finish the film, we find a venue that will hold 2,500 people because there's about 1,200 Pixar people and they all get to bring someone. And we all see the movie for the first time completely finished and put together with final sound and final music. And this is the 5+1 leadership team up on stage about to introduce the movie. And this is this moment where I feel like I finally was able to take a deep breath and kind of feel like not only that I had succeeded in this new role I had taken on, but more importantly, feel the victory of what we had all created together. And we had made this film with a unique style and a unique story, and we had this historic leadership team, but we had also done it during the pandemic, all working from home. We had delivered it several days early and well under budget. And more importantly, a crew that repeatedly told us how sad they were the movie was over because of what a great time they had had on the film. So technology has so much power, especially when it's combined with other things. And when we walk our own path, the one filled with things we love, not what others think we should do. even though there might be days of frustration like this, or days like this when the doubts creep in. But we hold on to that like scrappy, clever mindset when we're faced with the difficult or the impossible, and a willingness to throw out the normal way of doing things when needed. Never afraid to defy convention, and seek out the brilliant pops of green amongst the sea of beige. Perhaps we can create a world like no one has seen before. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to have her here.